Recording 3, 2, 1. And ladies and gentlemen, we are live. Welcome back to America's Martial Art Podcast, your number one source for everything combatives related. If you want to talk about shooting somebody up close, stabbing them up close, beating their ass, shooting fast, this is the podcast for you. So, my name is John Valentine, Jiu-Jitsu Black Belt, Combatives Black Belt, here your host, and I'm joined by my good friend, the great Matt Larsen, father of modern combatives. But first, guys, before we get into the show, we've got to talk about what we have coming up. September 20th to the 22nd, the Combatives Association Summit. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the second annual Combative Association Summit. It's going to be in Biloxi, Mississippi, specifically American Top Team D'Ulberville. Make sure you guys check that out. We have every world-class instructor. If he's done something in the combative space in the last, 50 years, he's there teaching. If you guys want to sign up for that, combativesummit.com. Make sure you guys use the code AMA. That's Alpha Mike Alpha for a discount. And guys, we also want to thank our sponsors, Tenacore Holsters. Guys, Tenacore Holsters, that is my number one choice for holster. I've been using the Velo now 3 years. I've used it for entangled work, shooting classes. I've graduated Top Gun from the Range Master Instructor Development course using the Tenacore Velo. I drive everywhere with it. I love that holster. Tenacore, they design products with the professional end user in mind. Make sure you guys check out Tenacore Holsters. We also got to thank First Responders Coffee. Guys, there's a lot of companies who say they are there for the first responder. FRCC, First Responder Coffee and Cigars, they take 20% of their proceeds, they put it aside, and if officers need training, they need instructors, they need equipment, they 100% will fund you. They'll take care of you guys. They put their money where their mouth is. Make sure you guys give them your patronage. First Responders Coffee Company and Cigars. We also have ATH supplements. Guys, it's an honor to have ATH on there. They've been sponsoring a lot of the professional jiu-jitsu athletes, a lot of guys that have been my coaches personally. So having them on board, supporting the Combative Summit is amazing. We also got to thank Cruise Combat. You want American-made fight gear, shorts, rash guards, and guys, even if you're not a martial artist, a rash guard, wear a black rash guard behind your pistol. I mean, it's a aids in your concealment. So make sure you guys get it. Go to Cruise Combat. In the show notes, you're going to have the link to the AMA rash guard as well as the Combative Association. The American martial art is one of Matt's most popular designs. So make sure you guys check that out. Make sure you pick one up. Also, guys, we got to thank Hairless Ape Conspiracy. So everything mindset, make sure you guys check out Hairless Ape Conspiracy. Evolution is overrated. So with that in mind, Matt, what's up, brother?
Not much, brother. Good to be talking to you again. It's been too long.
Yeah, man. So we kind of always get caught up in life and everything like that. And it's interesting, started life out as a soldier and then crossed over to the Air Force. And I feel like I follow your path just by kind of just staying the course of training. It's weird now getting this big institutional job. And, and so one of the things I wanted to talk to you too about that is how so many people working these positions or really, let's say, angling to get them, they don't really understand the deeper lessons here. They don't really understand what it takes to actually be successful in the long term, because we're always prepping for the future, really setting up that next generation. Like if you're coming in today, you got to think about what am I doing today that's going to affect 20 years? And so what do you think is kind of the biggest misconception as far as working a big instructor position?
Well, there are levels, right? What I would say is that low-level instructors are focused on technique. And that look, when you're the end user, you're the athlete, you're the guy on the beat or the soldier, you need the technique. It's the starting place, right? And everything builds off those techniques. But with that being said, it's like, imagine this, right? Like, what's the best way to hit a single leg for a high school wrestler? I don't know. And I can tell you this, every wrestling coach in the world has an opinion, and they're mostly valid, or else they wouldn't be successful wrestling coaches, and they're mostly different. Right? So what that tells you is there's a lot of good ways. And so if your focus as a bottom level instructor is on technique, you're probably in the right spot, right? But if you're wanting to manage a like build a program, you have to outgrow that focus on technique, because in the end, if try to think back for a second to how you learned how to do, or what were the first things you learned, for example, in ground grappling, because it's a big field, so there's lots. What was the first way you learned, how to pass the guard or get to the mount from side control, or, whatever, set up the berimbolo, whatever it is, right? The first way you learned it, it's probably not the way you do it now, right? You probably learned some way that worked for that other person. That was the foundation of your learning. And then you started rolling a lot, and then you gained a lot of experience. And then you figured out that, the architecture of your body was slightly different than the guy who taught you that technique. So it had to work differently for you. And so that's growth, right? Like that same sort of growth happens at the various levels of what you're trying to do. So, for example, if you're training just a bunch of athletes in your gym, you teach them that technique and then you help them adapt. So that's the next level, is how do you help them adapt, right, to their body style, etc. If you're trying to train an institution, you have to adapt as well, because the lessons are quite different. You know what I mean? So I just had a conversation with a guy, in fact, a guy who was in charge of all the hand-to-hand combat training for one of the European militaries. Yesterday, we just spoke for several hours, and they had a really good program going, right? But I had to ask him things like, what is the end goal of your first course? You have this, whatever your first course is, right? Maybe it's 16 or 60 hours or something like that, where you're trying to teach them. Okay, so what do you want them to get out of it? Because you can't learn to fight in 16 hours or 60 hours, right? You can't learn to box or be a proficient grappler or any of that stuff. You can only start on the path. Mm-hmm. So what are you trying to teach them? And what you're actually trying to teach them is what the path is. And you're trying to teach them that you want to get on that path, because that's the only way they're going to be proficient. So I'll just give you this as an example. So in the in the Army program, we teach a series of drills, right? At the basic level. Okay, so I would say that none of the techniques in those drills matter. Everybody gets all ass wrapped around like this is a better way to pass the guard, or this is a better way to hit the rear naked choke, or this is a better way to. None of that shit matters. And it doesn't matter, because at the end, what are they going to learn in that 1 week course or something like that they're going to know 6 years from now, 16 years from now, when they're 80 years old, they'll still know it. That will have changed the path of their life, because that's what a course is for, whatever a course, right? The idea behind a course, it's either the only purpose is to make money, or it's to change the path of the student's life so that they end up being more effective, being happier, blah, 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 right? Okay, so in our level 1 course, those goals are, they need to learn how to train. They need to learn, well, first off, they need to learn that's fun. Second, they need to learn how to train. And third, what they get out of it is an understanding of ground grappling. So let me boil that back a little bit. In every area of knowledge that you have, math, geography, whatever, right? There's a map in your brain that makes sense of it. Tells you how all the disparate elements of it relate to each other. How does division relate to the rest of algebra? How does that relate to geometry, right? Like, if those things are all related, and the more you know about it, the more sophisticated your map gets, but it's still what you learned at the beginning of that map is still going to be accurate, right? If you learn it well. And the same with every area of knowledge. In a learning theory, that's called a schema. So you have a schema in your head that makes you able to make sense of this area of knowledge. Okay, so in ground grappling, that schema is the hierarchy of position. So after you run through all of our courses, right, so if you're not familiar with it, the listeners, we teach a series of drills. Drill number 1 is escape the mount by rolling the person out. Second is pass the guard, and then achieve the mount from side control. And then we teach some submissions from the various positions, side control to mount. Okay, so then drill 2, take the back, escape the back, rear naked choke. Drill 3, escape the mount by shrimping to the guard, and then a submission and a sweep. So when that's over, like I said, it doesn't matter which guard pass you picked, right? It doesn't make any difference. What you're really learning is when you're in the legs, you should try to get past the legs, right? So at the end of the class, you never mention this before, and it doesn't get mentioned around the Army, but I always say, well, what's the worst position you could be in? And people say, oh, having somebody back mounted on you. All right. So that means it's slightly better if they're only mounted, right? It means it's slightly better if they're only in side control. It's slightly better if they're in your guard, and walk them all the way through it until from the worst position to the best position, you're now back mounted, right? So that's the schema of ground grappling. And that schema grows when you learn stuff outside of just that little limit of it. But almost everything you're going to learn the first couple of years of grappling should be within that schema. A new way to pass the guard, a new way to attack somebody from the back, a new way to escape the back, a new way to get to mount from side control, a new submission from the mount, a new submission from side control, a new relationship between a sweep and a submission attempt from the guard, etc. Right? So, but what they'll learn, you don't even have to mention it. The drills teach it. And they'll know that the rest of their life. Even if you never mention it, they'll know it because they'll know it instinctively because the drills taught it, right? And so that's a good example. Those are the terminal learning objectives, things you'll know 6 years later. So if you're teaching them like striking skills, if you give somebody 16 or 60 hours of boxing or kickboxing training, will they be proficient kickboxer?
No,
absolutely not. Right? Like, absolutely not. They will not even have enough experience to know how to spar effectively, right? Because that's just not enough time to develop that. But with that being said, what could you teach them in that amount of time? If you're thinking about what they'll learn forever from that class, it's not going to matter how you taught them to do the jab. Yeah. It's not going to matter how you taught them to defend the jab. It's going to matter deeper stuff than that. Right. Yeah. So that's I would say that's the real thing that people miss is they don't see the strategic side of learning. They only see the tactical side of learning. This is the best way to hold your hand when you're trying to do X. Hold your mouth like this. Don't put your tongue out in that direction. Put it out in this direction. Whatever, my hand goes like this or my hand goes like this. Which one's better?
Yeah,
it'll make a fucking difference, right? Like, it might make a difference, but if it makes a difference, you're going to learn when you start sparring. You put your hand the other way, right? Like, it's Matt Thornton's aliveness concept is a real. If you don't know who he is, look him up. Matt Thornton's a brilliant guy, but his aliveness concept is like, okay, the human body only moves in certain ways. You start grappling, you start striking. The lessons are inherent in the actions, right? Pretty soon, everybody's boxing in the world looks kind of similar, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how people are separated by literally, I know it's like the cool woke thing to knock Christopher Columbus, but like there was no connection between the world until he did that, right? Until he crossed over, and
except the Vikings, come on,
right. There we go. but before that, like we have all this history of people that have been training, fighting, because that's just wars existed before civilization, and just the similar techniques and just how these movement patterns have reasserted themselves over the course of the millennia. And the other side too that I think the listeners at home may not be aware of is like people were getting hung up around the axle about the outcome of like, okay, you go to a 1 week course and you're an instructor, and then eventually like a lot of soldiers treated that as a ranking system. But what they didn't realize is that you actually snuck in there. Like you gave them the outcome you gave the Army the outcome they wanted, but at the same time you pushed in there, subtly and tactically, right? The a process-driven, right? A process-driven approach. It wasn't necessarily the outcome. While I know a lot of people, they're going through the combatives program. It's the first time they're ever going to be hit. It's the first time they're ever going to be that close and in that kind of intense exchange. Yeah. And they do the option 3 drill, which is basically achieve a clinch on a puncher, which is achieve the clinch on a puncher. And so people see the outcome and they're not necessarily picking up the deeper things of that process driven approach. If not, now you know how to train means that you're supposed to go back to your unit, supposed to set up training and repeat and refine what you learned in the course. And I think that's something that
there's a couple of hidden lessons in there that are once again not necessarily obvious. So one of those is, that there's several levels. So there's several levels instead of like an 8-week course, because how much can you learn in 8 weeks? If you'd never dribbled a basketball before and we said, here is 8 weeks of basketball training, how good would you be at basketball at the end of 8 weeks? Well, your body can only learn movement patterns so quickly because you can only do so many repetitions, and you're creating those synaptic connections that are going to make you do it unconsciously, and you got to grow through the phases of psychomotor learning and So that's not the efficient way to do it, right? The better way to do it is introduce them, teach them these lessons. Now they know how to do it. Go out, learn those lessons. 6 or 8 months later, come back for the next lessons. Then go out a year or two later, come back for the next lessons. Like that's the constraints of institutional training. If you're in an organization, you have to work around those constraints. Okay. So that's the first one. It's not necessarily obvious, but that's why we set it up originally as 4 levels in the Army program, was because we expected people to go out and train in between the lessons so they would get better. So by the time somebody got, 1 week course, 6 or 8 months later, 2-week course, a year later, a 4-week course, a couple of years later, another 4-week course, all those courses were designed to do was guide your training in the interim, because you're not going to be that good after a 5-day course, right? So the second like hidden lesson behind the whole thing is the approach has to be cultural. And that's a complicated lesson. So here's what I mean by that. It must first fit within the existing culture of your organization. So what is the average person's life like on the short term and the long term in your organization? As by short term, I mean, here's what your day looks like. You show up, you do this, you do that, you do the other thing, you go home at the end of the day, right? And then the long term is, what are the gates in your career? You're going to be in this job for 3 or 4 years. You're going to be in this job for 3 or 4 years. You're going to be in this job for 3 or 4 years. What are those gates? What are the schooling opportunities, et cetera? You have to integrate it into all that stuff, right? So it's got to fit within the existing culture. And then it must have a transformative effect on the culture over time. So it's very hard to change a culture. And what I mean by change a culture, I mean change what people within the culture value in each other. Like, what does it mean? What does it look like to be a successful person in that job or in that organization or whatever? And every organization has their different things, So let me give you I'll give you a long score answer, but imagine what chivalry was, right? Originally, chivalry, it had nothing to do with courtesy. Chivalry meant the way. Cheval means horse, right? It meant the way of in French. So it meant the way of the mounted warrior. So what was the way of the mounted warrior? What was a way you became rich and famous in medieval France, right? Or in England, etc. So what was the way? Well, you proved yourself a badass. And if you proved yourself a badass, then people would give you land, right? That's the whole feudalism was. I'm going to give you land in exchange for your military service, right? Why would somebody give you land? Because you're a badass. They wanted you for military service. Well, how did you prove that? Well, you had tournaments and jousts and local conflicts and foreign wars, and you could have various levels of leadership. And as you proved yourself, you got more and more. You see what I mean? So it's like a path to riches, okay, or a path to success within that culture is a better way to say it, right? So every culture is like that. So, I work at West Point. What is the path to success as a cadet in West Point? Well, you have to do academic performance. You have to do physical performance. You see what I mean? There's elements of it that you have to show your capabilities. There's a military leadership side. These are the deeds you must do in order to be successful. And those people who are successful, they get out of there with accolades and get on the best jobs, get the jobs they want in the Army, et cetera, right? So every culture's got that sort of thing. So you have to understand what that is in the organization that you're trying to affect. I'll give you an example, right? Like, is physical fitness required in, your organization? Well, in the Army it is, right? But is it in most police forces?
No.
And I've never been a cop, but I've seen a lot of cops. I would say it is if you take a path like being a SWAT guy or something like that, but not for everybody, right? Like the unions fight against it, right? Like, so imagine you have all those cultural elements that you got to figure out in order to design a program. And I give this one a hit home to you because when we designed the Army program, we designed it around integrating combatives training into physical training. So everybody in the Army falls out every day, does PT. And mostly that's just, go for a run, do some sit-ups and push-ups, right? So we integrated those drills I was talking about earlier into that early. The whole thing is designed in drills that you could integrate into that session. So you could do, 15 repetitions of drill number 1 and then go for a run, that kind of thing. So if you do that, everybody can't avoid it. So they all have to learn it, even if they don't know how, right? Even if they don't want to, they still must, right? Like we have these standardized ways of stretching that I know your audience won't necessarily, but one of them is like a move called the high jumper. It's like you jump up and down like this. It's supposed to warm you up, right? And it's stupid. And yeah, everybody in the Army does it. So in my classes, when I'm teaching soldiers, I'm like, okay, I give the commands, right? Because it's drill commands, position of attention, move, the high jumper, ready, starting position, move, and go through the commands, right? And everybody does it. And I'm like, okay, so everybody in the Army knows the high jumper, right? And what happens if you don't know the high jumper? Somebody gives those commands, everybody starts to do it but you, and then everybody looks at you like a fucking crazy person, or like, and then you don't know the high jumper, and then what happens? Then they look at your squad leader, whoever's in charge of you, and they're like, your guy doesn't know the high jumper. And then what happens? You learn the fucking high jumper, right? Because you're expected to know it. He's expected to have taught it to you, right?
Right.
Okay, so so I always show them, okay, everybody knows that. Does everybody know the rear naked choke? Because the answer to that is no. And so we have unconsciously chosen the high jumper as more important than the rear naked choke. Because everybody knows the high jumper, not everybody knows the rear naked choke, right?
Right.
So I gave you another example of culture like that. This is old now, but I used to ask all soldiers, what's the one piece of equipment? I asked the chief of staff of the Army this one time, what's the one piece of equipment that everybody in the Army knows how to use? Okay, and you'd think it would be the rifle, right?
Yeah.
But I'm going to tell you, I was in the Army for 22 years, and I've been around it for 40 now. There are lots of people who are not proficient with a freaking rifle in the Army. Right? I was at a range one time, and we were issuing out ammunition, and we are just giving it on the stripper clips, and I gave this to this guy, some clerk or some time, and he just looked at me like I was crazy, and I was like, "You don't know how to load a magazine, do you?" He's like, "I never done it for." When I went to the range, it was always preloaded magazines. I'm like, okay, so you know what I mean. So that's a true story, right? Like people don't. Not everybody in the Army knows how to load a damn magazine, much less proficient with their rifle. And so I used to always say, but what does everybody know? Everybody in that Army used to know how to run a buffer, right? Like how to shine the floor.
Holy shit. Holy shit, that's so true.
Like everybody, right? When I said that to the chief of staff of the Army, he at one point, he was a cadet at some RTC unit or a brand new. Right. And if he's got hundreds of hours of experience.
A buffing world champion.
Right? They're both more in the Army because that's the old Army. But everybody knew how to run a buffer. Like, it's not easy. It's kind of complicated. You got to have a feel for it, right? Yeah. And so the Army unconsciously decided that the buffer was going to be something soldiers did more than the rifle, right? Like So those are unconscious decisions. So we can unfuck those unconscious decisions if we're smart about what we do and say, okay, you must know this. So back to what I was saying of integrating the culture. We put our drills so that they can be in PT, because just like the high jumper, everyone must know it. You can say, okay, 15 repetitions of drill number 1. And if somebody doesn't know it, you can look at them like they're a crazy person. Like, you don't know drill number 1? And then you can look at their boss.
Yep.
You don't know drill number 1.
Traditions.
And then he'll learn it. Right. And if this guy doesn't know it, you can be like, anyway, you get the idea. Integrate into the culture. And then once you integrate into the culture, it must have a transformative effect on the culture. So a lot of people have heard me tell the story of the Rangers when we used to fight, be called out to fight each other. But just imagine if you just have, whatever your section is, right? Let's just say 15 people of whatever this section is, in and the 15 Peace Corps people or whatever, and you put them all on their knees to grapple, what's going on? Well, what's actually going on is it's a social dynamic, right? It's a social event because you're doing it with a bunch of people. So everybody's judging each other, and some people are pansies and some people are tough. And so the tough people get a reputation and the pansies get a reputation too. So it's so that means over time, everybody starts to like judge each other on that. And that becomes something expected of you if you would like to be, that's why I say the lesson of in the Rangers, just so if you haven't heard the story, the Sergeant Major used to call people out once a month, like just random people, give me the first squad leader, first platoon Alpha Company. And then, the second squad leader, second platoon Bravo Company. Those two guys come out in front of the whole battalion and fight each other. And so what happens is that like shit talking, like pansy and the, over there from, Charlie Company or whatnot, he gets called out and then balled up. And then he's got to run back and take charge of his squad, right? And everybody now knows he's just a shit-talking pansy. Can't fight, right? So that happens one time, and it's no longer socially acceptable. Mm-hmm. And you do that exact same thing in a less stark way just by having everybody required to roll occasionally. Right. You know what I mean? Especially in some sort of organization where, like, people are would like to think that they're tough. You know what I mean? It just starts happening. And it's the same thing. If you go to the range, what do? Well, if you don't keep score, nobody cares how well they did. If you post all the scores, then you make fun of the people at the bottom, right? Mm-hmm. Let the guys at the top wear special hats or something, right? Like, I mean, everybody's, I don't know, what do you think the Green Beret is, right? Like, we let people wear special hats for high performance in the Army, right? So Tambourine, same thing, right?
Right.
Anyway, so you give them special hats and shit, and then everybody's like going, "Oh, that special hat guys are cool," and "Oh, these turds are not." And then pretty soon you have a social dynamic that's pushing people towards excellence. You see what I mean, right? So anyway, so we built that all into the Army around PT. But then when we were trying to design a program for the Air Force, okay, so one difference between the Army and the Air Force is the whole Air Force doesn't do PT every morning, right? So that system isn't going to work in that sort of organization. So it had to be a different way of integrating into the culture because it's a different culture, right? It's the same. So like when people come and say, okay, how do we get cops training? Oh, well, what's the culture look like? Do cops do PT? No. So you can't do that method. No. Okay, so what else? Well, hourly employees, mostly. That means that every hour that you're training, you're not patrolling. They've got to pay you for not patrolling. So therefore, it's a budget issue, right? And then there's going to be pressure from the top not to do much of that. And that's why we have a set number of hours that must be done in most police forces, because they're getting around that. They're mandating that you pay for at least this much training when those guys won't be on the roll, right? It's also like if you have a union, so you have workman's comp issues. Yeah. So if you train realistically, you're going to have people faking injuries because here's a little trivia for you. You know what federal organization has the highest number of people who are getting paid but not working because of workman's comp issues? It's the Border Patrol. Yeah. The reason they have is because they have a lot of soldiers and Marines and stuff like that come into that force. And then you have a lot of people who weren't those things. So the soldiers and Marines come in and like want to train the way they did when they were in the military, and the other guys don't necessarily want to, and they have an out, what I'm saying? Right. So, oh, my knee, right? Well, how do you know if the guy's knee's man? Oh, my back, back, my neck, back of my neck, right? So pretty soon you got guys who are like able to like skate the system because the system is built in for that, and you got the union that's going to back them up, right? You see what I'm saying? So all those are cultural issues that you have to overcome, right? So most police forces, they have good training at the beginning, especially these days. Most of the guys doing the training at the beginning of the career when you're in like the FBI Academy or, the State Police Academy or something like that. Mostly the training is great, right? Yeah. Because the people who know what they're doing are like some of us, right? So with that being said, then you go out into the force, and what are you doing? Well, you come in every day, you muster, get out on the road. You know what I mean? So wins the opportunity? I don't know, because I'm not in that world, but those are the obstacles, and that's what you must do if you're going to have something. It's like, remember the guys were saying, "Oh, like, we got to get every cop trained in jiu-jitsu." Okay, does every cop want to train jiu-jitsu?
Absolutely not.
The answer is no.
Yeah.
Okay, so then how are you going to make them?
Right.
Because you have to figure out a way, right?
Yeah.
You're going to order them to, or you're going to make social pressure for them to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, there's got to be an answer that's a smart answer. You're not going to say everybody in the city of Chicago police force is going to train jiu-jitsu at all the local jiu-jitsu gyms. Go. And it's going to happen. It's not going to happen like that, right? That is a pipe dream. It's not going to ever happen like that, because it doesn't fit the culture that exists in that force, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah.
You have to
and you got too many people that are in very, very powerful positions right now, that they were already successful in the previous paradigm. They're not going to destroy the foundations of their career with something that
that's the same. Look, when we were pushing combatives through the Army, the biggest obstacle is cowardly leadership. Because imagine you're in some elite unit and you are at the top of your craft and you have been one of the most successful soldiers and everybody thinks you're a badass, but learning how to fight wasn't part of it, right? Because it wasn't. Nobody was really learning how to fight back in the 70s and 80s, right? Like,
or they just transpose like, oh, this guy's an expert, so he's a good fighter too, or he's an expert shooter,
right? Like he's a triathlete type fit,
right?
Right? Like, okay, so, but that don't have shit to do with fighting, right? Well, it does. It does in the way that, like, what I like to say is, look, fitness without training is like intelligence without education. You know what I mean? It's like the same thing. So you're a very smart person who doesn't know how to read. Got it. Right? Like, you're super fit. Don't know shit about fighting.
Right.
Cool. Gonna be rough to beat you, but it's gonna happen. I'm gonna have to deal with your athleticism. But I'm gonna beat you. Like,
right.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's, that idea that you're gonna have to deal with that is just part of it, right? Like, that's why you can't change it overnight. It's got to be cultural change. I've been working on changing the culture of the Army since 1994, 1995, when we started the Combatives program. Okay, so that's 30 years ago, right? So how much has it changed? Well, a lot, but we're not all the way there. It's definitely not a requirement for every soldier to be a good fighter, to be respected, and to be able to be advancing in their career. And until we get to that point, we won't be successful, right? Like, that's the measure of success. If every soldier must be a competent fighter in order to be respected and advance in their career, the Combatives program has succeeded. And if it hasn't, well, the percentage that isn't that is the percentage of our failure, right? So that's a high standard, because a lot of people don't want to do it, right? Like, what's the difference between, this is the most important thing, right? What's the difference between teaching at a local martial arts school or at a seminar compared to training a unit?
Well, people are signing up. If people don't sign up to the,
everybody comes in that martial arts school is there because they want to be, and they're paying you to teach them.
Right.
Super easy to teach them. They're self-motivated. Same thing with a seminar. Okay, so the part that's not there is, how do you motivate them?
Right.
And in any kind of organization, Army, cops, Navy, whatever, you have to provide, the leaders have to provide the motivation. You have to be the ones who get people fired up about learning it. And you have to do that by being smart and understanding the levers you have that you can pull to be able to get them to be fired up about it. Right. And if you can't do that, you're a failure. Right?
So let me ask you the question that's kind of like the unspoken question, right?
Right.
Let's say, now that I'm kind of a bit older, I mean, I was tempered in my youth, so it was just like, if I looked at a, dude that was nearly 40 and he couldn't fight, I looked at him with contempt. But now that I'm, looking real fucking close at 40 myself, I kind of understand, I kind of get it, right? But I've trained my whole life, so it's not so intense for me. But let's say I'm an E7, I'm a senior NCO or, a mid-tier officer, right? And you're asking me to bring this in to my organization. And what I'm worried about is that I'm going to be looked at with contempt or be undermined by my subordinates because like I'm not going to be good. I'm not as physically capable as I once was. And so this program bringing this in it's really it's threatening to my social status, right? So why should I, how do I bring this in without basically diminishing myself in the eyes of my subordinates?
Yeah. So the answer to that is that it's like the answer to that is like PT. And here's what I mean by that, right? So the Army used to have a manual called Leadership for Senior Leaders. Physical Fitness for Senior Leaders. And so the purpose of the manual was to show that physical fitness for senior leaders was about a display, so a show. So imagine, why do we need the division commander, 2-star general, to be fit? Like, we need him to be healthy, right? Because we don't want him croaking out in the middle of the war. Right. But why does he need to be fit? Like, he's a smart person is why he's there. He's got a lot of leadership experience. He can literally do that stuff from a litter. Like, many commanding generals in the past have done so because they had their leg blown off or some shit, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so the answer is, for the perspective of his craft, and don't underestimate that. What does it take to fight a division? Well, it's more than we can explain because it takes a long freaking time to learn it, right? All the logistics, all the maneuver, all that shit's tough stuff, right? Okay, so that's their real craft. Why do they need to be fit then? Well, they need to be fit to inspire the men. Like, that's the whole point, right? Okay, so now imagine you're a division commander. You're a 2-star general. You've been in the Army for 35 years, something like that. You're in your 50s, and now you've got to go out and show all the paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne that you're a stud. How do you do it? Well, you plan for it, right? You're like, okay, we're going to have a Division 5-mile run on August 7th. And I'm going to periodize my freaking PT so that is my performance. And when I get on that freaking road, I'm going to run that 5 miles and look like a stud, even if I have to take freaking salt baths for the next 4 days to recover from it, right? Because that was my show, to show everybody that I was fit. Okay, so that's the way older people have to think about, like, leadership roles. You know what I'm saying? I'm 57, right? And I wrestle with freaking, college kids mostly. You know what I'm saying? Like, some of them are like, a whole shitload of them are Division I athletes. I got the football team and the wrestling team and so what do I do? Right. I can tell you what I do, man. I'm smart about it. I look at a class of, 35 or so young, 20-year-old studs, and I look and find somebody who's in the top tier of the room, who's not a spaz, and then I ball that guy up because I know he won't hurt me. And I can beat him. And then everybody else gets to see me ball that guy up, and I don't have to do much else, right? I have to do that one thing, and I don't have to like roll for 45 minutes because I'm gonna gas because I'm not as fit as I used to be, and I'm gonna not get injured because I'm susceptible to that, right? If I fight somebody who's like a defensive tackle, it's like 280 pounds of freaking 20-year-old Division I athlete, I don't have to be careful, right? So I don't. I make sure I'm fighting the guy who's like, 220, who's smooth roller. You know what I'm saying?
Right. What's interesting too, as far as the displays, I never even thought about this. It kind of connected these ideas because we have a mutual friend and John Spencer with chairman of the Modern War Institute, and we started talking about social media and how, and he was like, no, I'm not ever leaving social media. Social media is the realm of ideas, right? I was like, okay, I better start putting my ideas out on social media. And I have a training company and I'm still active duty and everything like that. And what I didn't realize is that a lot of my subordinates at the organization I work for, they started following me on social media and they started seeing the things I was doing, because like, you can't fake lifting, 3-something, or you can't fake the shooting, you can't fake the martial arts. And so inevitably I started getting people, subordinates, that were just asking me questions. And then they started coming to matches. And like now I've got like 7 people from an organization of cops, right? Of Air Force cops. So it's like now coming to shoot matches or just coming to come train with me. And, it's a good time. We have a good, we talk about career progression and all these things. And I never even really thought about it in terms of being in a tool that way, in terms of inspiring younger generation for lethality.
That is an outgrowth of the proper leadership approach, right? So imagine when I was running the program for the Army, when I was still down at Camp Moore, there would be people who come in or call me up and they'd be like, man, I'm just newly assigned to whatever base, whatever division. How do I get the position of being the division trainer so I can make the combatives program happen? I would always say, you can't. Why the hell would somebody like do that? You haven't created the conditions for the person who would have to pay the check for that to want that to happen. So how do you do it? Well, who are you in charge of? Okay, train them. And if you do that well, you'll get to train more people.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because people will come to you. And social media is just an extension of that same idea. When people, there's a whole lot of bullshit on social media, but it is also a bullshit filter, because we can look at people and say, oh yeah, that guy's real. I mean, like, I'll just give you an example of that. The whole combatives, organization and all that. How did that happen? It happened through social media. Like we knew people, we knew each other, and we mostly knew each other from that sort of thing, right? And then eventually we started being able to say, that guy is real, and what that guy's teaching is good, and because when you know about fighting, you know when something's bullshit or not.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's like go back and look at all. If you're having a lot of people have all those jiu-jitsu books that were published back in the early days of MMA when jiu-jitsu was spread around America, and there was every single person in the jiu-jitsu world had a book out. Like every single member of the Gracie family, and like everybody else, right? So I have all those books too. So go back through them and look back through the techniques and look how many of them are actually like real, because it's not all of them, right? And we're talking about like the best guys in the world, right? Because they're like, I'm ready to make a book. Okay, well, what should I teach? Well, that's a great question. What should you teach that's going to make it where your shit is like standing out from the crowd and blah, 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 blah. Well, those criteria are not necessarily the criteria of this is the best way to do something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's one of the things too, like the lessons lost. Like, again, right? Like I was being kind of a, tough guy, for lack of a better word, right? And young. And I didn't understand diplomacy in the sense of my boss's success depended on how good I made him look or her look, and helping them become successful. And I think that's something that is totally bypassed, that people don't think about with these programs. It's like, you got to throw your boss a bone, because that, like, they're doing the labor of logistics and organization.
Your program has to be about the mission.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the best way to say that, right? Because it's just a microcosm of that. Like, and I'm sure this happens in other types of organizations, but if you would like to kill a combatives program in an Army unit, the best way to kill it is to make it a jiu-jitsu club or an MMA club. Like, we'll kill it, right? Like, because as soon as it becomes about what the hobbyists want it to be about, right? Like the people who are just totally fired up about jiu-jitsu or MMA or something, then it becomes this niche thing. The Army doesn't give a shit what your hobby is. Yeah. And if they don't care, it's like having a skydiving club, right? Okay, so we're not going to get every member of the 82nd Airborne to skydive. So what's the skydiving club for? Well, it's a hobby for some guys, and we can use them at football games to make displays, right? Right. Okay, so if you'd like that to be the level of your combatives program, make it a jiu-jitsu club. You go win every tournament in the state. Be kick ass, man. You put together a team, go out and win the Mundials. Cool. And your program's going to die in 3 or 4 years, because everybody else is going to look at it like your hobby, roll around in pajamas and whatnot. And then they're going to be like, and the commanders who are not interested in it are going to be like, yeah, we're not paying for that.
Right.
And it'll die, right? Like, so if you would like to have a successful program, it's got to be about the mission. So, this is an Army example, but you can extrapolate this into any organization. If your program is about going to the company commanders and helping them enhance their training so their soldiers are more likely to survive on the battlefield, they're more likely to accomplish their missions in a better way, then they will love it and you will thrive. And that's got shit to do with MMA or jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Meanwhile, most of your actual personal training is probably just rolling around in your pajamas or no gi or something like that. And that's cool. But that's not what's selling the program. That's
right. But even then, that's a means. That's not the ends kind of thing.
Right. Right. The end is the unit more capable?
Right.
Right. So I'll give you an example. Right. So imagine this. Right. In the early part of the war, the way we thought that hand-to-hand combat would go down would be like go through the door, have some sort of malfunction, and then click, bang, and then close the gap, ball them up, get your friends to help you. So we thought that would be the way it went. Right. And in kinetic warfare, it kind of does happen like that a lot. Mm-hmm. But what really started happening was complicated situations. Like you go through the door and you're trying to get dude, and so who are you going to end up fighting? Well, his wife, right? Because she's coming at you, right?
God bless her.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Or like I said, the classic one I always use is an old man standing with his hands up. And behind him is a door, and you don't know what's behind the door. It's either a bomb factory or his naked daughter.
Right.
Okay, so even when this dude starts fighting you, you don't know if he's the enemy, right? So are you going to shoot him? Well, the ROE will let you, because if the dude grabs your rifle, you shoot the guy, right? You're not going to get in trouble. But everybody in town knows you just murdered old man Smith, and he just didn't want you to see his naked wife.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's how it started becoming. All the fights started becoming like that. Okay, so what that tells you is, you have, as a soldier, for example, on the battlefield, you have like a moral responsibility to be able to manhandle people so that you don't have to kill them all, right?
Yeah.
Like if you have the old saying, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? Well, we carry rifles, and every problem isn't a target.
Right.
So the I would just shoot you crew, the I don't really want to train combatives because I'm a pussy crew, like that crew will shoot the dude because they don't have another answer.
Yeah, that's something we got to really, I think, get explicit about too, because blowback, right? The psychological warfare, the propaganda war, like this is what we're mitigating. We're mitigating that blowback from the local community. Like the whole, like the politicians love to talk about the hearts and minds and getting people to love. But like if we have guys that they're too afraid to train because they're losing their social status, and they're going in and they're capping these senior citizens essentially. Those are the guys that are really losing the war for us.
Yeah, I mean, modern wars is complicated, right? But there's a large like a psyops portion of it, and if you don't understand that, you're going to lose because of your lack of understanding. You know what I mean? And I'll give you an example, right? So, not to get into what's going on between Israel and Hamas right now in Gaza and whatnot, but imagine in the previous wars, because in one of the previous wars, Hezbollah, which is Lebanon, and Israel had a fight. And it doesn't matter who started it. What matters is this: the Israelis kicked that ass on the battlefield, right? Mm-hmm. Took all the ground they wanted to, etc. But if you ask everybody afterwards what happened, well, they ended up losing because the other side was totally, the purpose of their operations was psyops. Like the whole idea, we're going to attack this because it will play out in the news like this. We're going to shoot this munition here, target this because it will inspire this action, right? Like just to get into, there's a thing called a dilemma operation, right? So a dilemma operation is when you take an action where any response is going to be bad. right? Like they do it in protests all the time, right? We're going to occupy the main part of campus. Okay, and we're going to sit there and say that we're having a library to teach in, and it's all love and apple pie and shit. And if you don't do anything, you look weak because now we own your shit, right? If you do something, it's brutality. You look like shit. So they've set that up on purpose. This is dilemma operation because they knew they were putting you in that bad spot to make where both choices that you could do were the wrong choice, right? Okay, so that's the same. That tactic plays out in war in exactly the same way, just with larger consequences, right? You can use a dilemma action. Okay, so the answer to that problem is be well trained.
Yeah.
Because if you're not well trained, then it really will be bad. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm saying? So we end up with situations like that, like frequently. The answer to all those is be better trained. We have to have all the options across the spectrum of force at our disposal because we're freaking experts at all that shit.
Yeah.
Like if you want to claim to be a badass, okay, man, be a badass. Meaning I can handle this guy easily because I am better trained.
Yeah, and we've got to take into consideration like how there are just people out in the force, whether you're military or police, they're there for the check, right? And you tell them these ideas of these large operational strategic concepts, and I think what is interesting about the combatives is that it puts them in a situation where they get to understand those things. They get to understand leverage, right? From a tactical perspective, they get to understand these dilemmas. They have a tangible way of getting them, right? Even if they can't really explain it, they still get to experience
I think your program must be sophisticated enough it must be sophisticated enough where it's you are taking into account the capabilities of the people at every level of your organization. Mm-hmm. So what I mean by that is, like, as I said earlier, our level 1 course, the actual course objectives include teaching the schema of ground grappling, which is the hierarchy of position, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so they don't say that ever in the course. Mm-hmm. They don't have a test on it. They don't question them about the hierarchy position. Everybody learns it because the drills teach it to them. Right. So you're not putting on the instructors, because look, how long ago did I come up with that curriculum? 95, right? Like a long time ago, right? So that being said, you got people out there teaching that stuff now, which are 20 generations removed from me. So we're going to have some sort of intellectual like game of telephone going on, so that by the end of it, like the catchphrases are the same, but they don't have the meaning anymore, because are all those guys in that chain capable of passing it on to the next guy in a way where the meaning is clear and the verbiage is clear? And the answer is no, not reliably. That can't happen. So it's got to be built into the program at a level that doesn't require that, right? So, because this is combatives, we end up with a lot of freaking tough guys, right? So, you know what I mean? Like tough people, they're good at being tough, and they're good at teaching people techniques, and they're good at so I say, okay, teach this technique, this technique, this technique, this technique. That seems like the goal. Do that, be successful. But the actual goal was something that you learned from those techniques, not the techniques themselves. Right. Yeah. So you don't have to have the instructor who even can intellectualize that or articulate it. He just teaches the techniques. Yeah. And then levels below that, levels above that, the students are learning something that, this guy knows, but he doesn't maybe necessarily know it intellectually, but he just knows it instinctively because he's a fighter. There's no fighters who don't understand the hierarchy of position. Who just know it. Right. Even though you come I had a student one time, I'm not going to say her name. Okay. This is my girlfriend, Lauren. So, she had been training before she met me, and she had random techniques, right? Because her instructor beforehand was didn't have, most people teach things in a way that makes sense. In other words, okay, so you're mounted, and here is a chain of attacks. You try this, they might defend it like this. So you tried this. They might defend it like this. So you tried this, right? Like related things. And if you do that stuff sort of systemically over the course of a year, everybody gets to like the same lesson I'm trying to get at. They sort of learn the hierarchy position vicariously, even though nobody mentions it.
Right.
When she came to me, she like didn't have that at all. because the techniques had just been taught at her in a random fashion.
So there was no congruency in terms
right.
of like,
so I had to like come back and like intellectualize it and say, look, you're here. What's your goal?
Right.
Okay, you're here. What's your goal? And go through all the positions that you could find yourself in, generic positions, side control, mount, back mount, blah, blah, blah. Like, what's your goal? What are your possibilities? Right? What do you try to avoid? What's their goal? What are they trying to do? So what do you got to stop them from trying to do? And pretty soon, like, she was like, nobody explained that to me before. I'm like, yeah, well, if you teach correctly, you don't have to explain that because it's inherent in the teaching. Mm-hmm. If you teach incorrectly, they won't learn it. And they might be competent fighter, but like they'll do dumb shit in the middle of fights.
Yeah, it's also illuminating too that the instructorship craft itself, like that's its own skill. Like you could be a really badass fighter, really have some good techniques, but as far as being able to transpose that from your mind to another and making them do it as well, like that's a whole other thing.
I also think that people don't necessarily understand the nature. Like, I don't think people understand the nature of fighting at the higher level. Meaning, for higher level people, a whole lot of stuff is just ad lib, right? Mm-hmm. Because fighting is actually just a movement pattern, and the techniques you're learning are just a metaphor, or they're like a little snippet of that movement pattern. Do this technique. So within that technique, you're moving the way you should as a fighter. Okay, so if you do enough of that, your body internalizes those movement patterns so that when you're fighting, you just have your hand in the right spot. You know what I mean? Like, okay, he's coming around here. I pummel the underhook because that's what's going to be able to put me out. I just feel it, right? Like I don't. Right. It's not like, okay, what's the technique?
You're not going through the OODA loop situation, right?
Right. There's no OODA loop going on. You're just feeling everything and responding in the movement pattern, right? Like your body has learned it and internalized it, right? Mm-hmm. That's called so it's called in the stages of psychomotor learning, right? They're the cognitive phase. That's where you're learning things intellectually, like when you see it and you know it, but you can't make your body do it quite yet. And then you've got the associative phases, which where you're doing it a lot of times, often called practice. And what's really happening in practice is you're forming those synaptic connections to make that movement pattern happen. So when you feel stuff, you have the next thing ready, right? And then the last one is called autonomic phase, because that's when you would put it into your autonomic nervous system, and therefore you don't have to think about it. Like, for example, if you have a basketball player dribbling down the court, they're not thinking about dribbling, right? Yeah. They're thinking about tactics. We're the good guys, we're the bad guys. What play are we running? How are we going to score? Because they have dribbled so much in practice that's natural, normal movement for them. They don't have to think about it. So a good fighter, it's natural, normal movement. They don't have to think about it, right? They might be thinking about strategies. I'd like to get here. I'd like to push him. I'd like to maneuver him over into that shitter stall so that I'll, you know what I mean? I'll push this guy up underneath the freaking urinal so that I can get his head up against the wall, right? You might be thinking like that, right? But as far as how your hands go, you're just doing that in real time, and your autonomic nervous system is making the decisions, right? And I'll tell you a story to illustrate the point on that. I've been in the room before when some, my jiu-jitsu teachers, Jacare Cavalcante is where my black belt's from. And so he's got some of the top, the alliance. He's the head of the alliance. He's got some of the top, black belts in the world. They used to come by our studio all the time. Like Marcelo Garcia and like Lucas Lepre.
Yeah, Fabio Grisel.
Exactly right. Yeah, Fabio's the best teacher in the world. Like no shit, right? But anyway, so with that being said, I've seen some of those guys, top level guys like that, like Ted and A or something, like rolling with each other, filming themselves roll, and then watching the film and going, oh, that was cool. And then like practicing it so that they could teach it at a seminar. Like they made it up, right? Like, well, they did make it up, but they made it up in real time under fight conditions, right? Like they made up that shit because they move well, and they came up with it like in an ad hoc, like in an ad lib fashion. And then they practice it, like come back and drill it. They could be like, we'll be better if I put my hand here. Like, yeah, well, you know what I mean?
Man,
You know what I mean? Like a jiu-jitsu
yeah.
black belt can like analyze a technique like that and say, it'd be better if my hand was like this because he couldn't get around here. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I've seen him doing that. And so that's just like a examination of like, what are we really trying to accomplish with our students, right? What we're really trying to do is we're trying to give them enough practice that they internalize the movement patterns so they become a fighter.
Yes.
Right? Like,
yeah,
that's the answer.
And also like we're kind of like the idea of just like being very, very like there's definitely a role for teaching people tactics, teaching the IMTs and teaching them exactly like, break contact, all the kind of the battle drills, right? Standard battle drills. But at the same time, kind of dialing down and trying to like, oh, well, this specific, like there's no one operation to define them all. So when we should look at those things as more as fundamental concepts. And whether you're talking about shooting, you're talking about movement, you're talking about fighting, all these things. Like, okay, I'm extracting the core skills involved with, we'll just say ground grappling, just for as a placeholder. But we can start taking that same approach to pretty much anything, and start like, oh, okay, I can solve this problem because I have a wide fundamental foundation, right? Like I think a lot of people when they're focused on an outcome, like becoming an instructor or something like that, what happens is they peak out really fast. And what happens is if you got a building that's standing really tall, really straight, has a really flimsy foundation. So almost the slightest thing will break it, right? And then they don't really understand why.
So this is every craft, every area of specialty, and just to so everybody can understand what I'm talking about. Imagine the difference between infantry and law enforcement, right? Okay, so they have things in common, okay, but there are fundamentals of the craft that the other one don't have to know at all. You know what I mean? So I'm an infantryman primarily, and a raid guy, right? And so the fundamentals of that craft, they start with individual movement techniques, move as a member of a fire team, movement to contact, fire maneuver, like those are like fundamental building blocks of how you do it. Now, how do you learn them? Well, you do them in the most simplistic fashion. Every squad in the Army does this, right? They go to a range to do a squad movement to contact live fire. They move in traveling formation, which means a fire team in a wedge and another fire team in a wedge and a machine gun probably in the middle with the squad leader. They make contact with some element. That lead fire team deploys, reports, or engages, engages the enemy, deploys and reports. Then the squad leader makes a decision. We're going to put the gun in on the left. We're going to maneuver to the right, which is most likely choreographed because the range says you have to do this way because the range fires or this direction, etc. So you're doing this in this super canned way all the time. But what are you really learning? Well, you're going through the motions of when is the decision to be made? What are the options you have? Et cetera, et cetera. So eventually, when you've been doing that for a little bit, a couple of years, you can be like, okay, well, here's how you maneuver that way. Here's how you get a squad moving. Here's how you get your fire team to do what you want to do. Here's how you evaluate terrain so that you would, be able to implement these plans. You know what I'm saying? So it's like it's not different than what I was saying earlier about the drills.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like I'll give you an example of that. Like when you make contact in combatives in a war zone, right? So there's a fundamental principle. It mirrors the fundamental principle of infantry tactics. Okay, so infantry tactics, when you're doing a movement to contact, the idea is that you make contact with the smallest possible element. So that means if you have 150 men in a company and you're moving towards the enemy, you would like to make contact with one fire team. That's 4 dudes, because then the other 146 guys can maneuver around, right? Like outmaneuver the bad guys. Okay, so that idea in combatives is gain control at the farthest possible range. So, for example, if I freaking can point my rifle at you and say, lay down or I'm going to shoot you, and they lay down, I have gained control. Right?
That's very effective.
A little better. Like getting up in there with them, right?
Right.
Okay, so that principle, it gained like range. That's why, for example, you have familiar with the post frame hook, which Greg Thompson was the guy who came up with that from the SOC P system. But that's the idea. post is just like you're stiff arming a guy, like you're a fullback coming around the edge. You got frame, that's like a Muay Thai from, right? You just hold them off with 90 degrees, like Tony Blauer's outside 90 spear system, right? Mm-hmm. And then inside that, it's pummel for underhooks, overhooks, head control, etc. So post frame hook, right? So those are ways to stop the person at the farthest range that you're able to. Mm-hmm. Okay, so once you've stopped them, we're going to call those lines of defense, right? Now what? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's immediate action, what you do when you make contact. Okay, so let me give you a parallel from infantry tactics. When you make contact and you're that lead fire team, what do? Immediate action. Well, what's the immediate action? Return fire, take cover, report. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's what you do. You see them, or they shoot at you, you shoot back, you take cover, you tell somebody else what's going on so that the rest of the unit can maneuver, right? Okay, so now that's immediate action. You stopped them at post range or frame range or something. Now what do? Mm-hmm. Now it's time for a decision, okay? Well, in infantry tactics, the same idea. You've done immediate action, time for a decision. What are the options? Right. You can put 2 fire teams on line and assault through. You can lay down a base of fire and maneuver, or you can break contact. Like those are options, right? And the what's happening in the fight is going to dictate it for you, right? Which one you're going to take. Or it might be like dictated in advance because like you're a 3-man element, you make contact, you're going to break contact.
Yeah, right.
But you get the idea, right? So the same thing, true. You stop the guy at your farthest range of or your farthest range you could, post range, frame range, etc. Mm-hmm. Now what? Now you make a tactical decision. Well, what are the tactical options? Well, option 1, push him away, get back to projectile weapons range, right? Like if I can push him away and put my gun at him again, that's better, right?
Right.
Or if I can't, maybe they're holding on to my kit, I can't push them away, time to go to a secondary weapon. Because a lot of times your rifle's jammed up in between you, so you can't get it in play, right? So pull your secondary weapon. That could be a pistol or a knife, right? Interestingly enough, at some point, the knife is actually superior at that range because you can grab the pistol and now you're fighting over the pistol. But if you pull a knife out, much more difficult to grab while you're playing sewing machine with them, right? So anyway, but now what if they go for their weapon first? Well, now it's a race. If you go for yours, they're going to beat you because they got the advantage on you, right? So what now? Well, now you close the gap, gain control, take them down. You know what I mean? Like you have those options and they mirror those options in infantry tactics, right? Time for a decision. Here are the options. Okay. And you can drill that sort of stuff in the same simplistic way that you drill infantry tactics. And pretty soon you're handling the situation wisely tactically because you know what you need to consider at each of these places. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. That's, and also because the people are drilling it and they're doing it over and over. It's automatic. It's not going in a cognitive thing of like, okay, let me do this. It's like they're recognizing what's happening and they're just responding appropriately, not reacting, right? Responding appropriately.
Right. Exactly right. And the training also, like to make the training real, I'll give you an example, right? If you go back, 15 years or so, all the knife fighting training that was going on in the world was like 2 dudes with knives dueling with knives, right? Like, and you're doing the hubud or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So with that being said, okay, what are the odds in the world? You're down to just your knife and you have it in your hand and you run into somebody else down to just their knife and they have it in their hand and you both look at each other, you're like, ha! And then like the music starts. You know what I mean? Because the only way that's happening is like on stage, right? Like you're filming West Side Story again for your high school play. Okay, so now what you see is like stuff like the knife control concept guys are doing, like, okay, so odds that you would get in a fight with somebody who has a blade or a weapon on them are pretty damn good. So you must fight everybody as if they might be armed, right? Yeah. Might be a gun, might be a knife. You got to fight them as if they are because they get that free hand. You pay the piper, right? It's like you get them in a triangle choke and they got that free arm and you're getting stabbed in the lungs, right?
Right.
Collie defense of the triangle choke is almost 100% successful, right? Like
right.
So
cut the taint.
right, exactly right. So, even worse, right? Things can get worse. Right? so you have to fight as if that's a thing, right? And your grappling training has to like transition into that because that's normal, right? Okay, so what does happen with blades is maybe you separate, like realize the guy's got a blade and you can get away from him now. Now what? Now you're exactly into the curriculum that those guys teach, right? Because that's how it plays out. And I'll tell you even more to it. Like most training is missing the most common or the most important aspect of the fight. Yeah. So let me give you a metaphor for that. So in laser tag, right? What's missing that makes it unrealistic?
There's right.
Nobody's afraid, right? So everybody's a fucking hero in laser tag, right?
Right.
Nobody's afraid. So there's no fear involved in the fight. Right. Okay, but in real fights, there's fear, right?
Right.
So imagine some dude's in front of you with a knife. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to be like, try not to get stabbed, right?
Right.
Which means he's going to have to come at you with his blade. And when he commits that blade to you, that arm is ripe for the picking, right?
Mm-hmm.
And now you're right into exactly that kind of similar techniques to what, the knife control. I don't want to say that's the only thing going on that's great, but their stuff is good because it's built on those realities right there. Live training from what we get from wrestling, jiu-jitsu, MMA, blah, blah, blah. And the idea that the fight is going to play out like this because everybody's scared shitless in a fight. Imagine how scary it is when you're in a fight and there's a knife involved in the fight.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like one of us going to get killed,
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I always, on another aspect of that, right? In our training at West Point, what we do is every student's got to do 3 like grappling matches, which are essentially like jiu-jitsu matches, right? And then they all do 2 matches, which are like limited MMA. And so imagine after the first fights, I talked about the difference between the intensity level when you're just rolling in class and who's good and whatnot. And now how much more intense is it whenever you put grades on the line and it's a competition? So it's the reason why if you're a jiu-jitsu guy, you should go to competitions, right? You should go to competitions because it's fucking way different when the guy's really trying to beat you because there's something on the line. It goes harder. It's more intense.
Yeah.
Okay. Even though some of the techniques are not going to be realistic, the intensity is more, right? And the same thing is true of MMA, right? What's the difference between MMA and jiu-jitsu? Well, the difference is the intensity is more because somebody's getting their ass beat, right? Like the difference between MMA and all other sports is that the loser gets their ass beat. Right? You know what I mean? Like boxing's got that element going on too, right? Like, so it's not, nobody gets their ass beat at the end of a soccer match, right? Like, it's like, oh, I lost, rats. You know what I mean? Like the MMA, it's like, oh, I lost. Now let me go get my freaking bones set, right? Like, I just got my ass beat. Okay, so that intensity level. Now imagine the difference between an MMA fight and a fight over a knife. Right? The intensity level is going to be turned up to 11 now, right? Because somebody's getting killed and you're freaking going to be like maxed out on everything. Well, how do you prepare for that shit? That's how you prepare. You do increasingly intense training, So roll in your gym, spar in your gym, enter tournaments, boxing match, kickboxing match, jiu-jitsu tournament, MMA fights, etc. And there's realities built into those things, right? Have you seen these guys like I don't remember who it was. I saw the other day somebody who was like a actual MMA fighter, and they had him go against 3 people, and the 3 people were essentially smaller than him, right? It was
that was in like Russia or something like that,
right, something like that, right?
Yeah,
some craziness. Anyway, what does it look like? Well, what does it look like to box 3 dudes? Well, they got 6 arms.
Yeah,
that'll tell you something. Like it's quite challenging.
Yeah, 4 words, not a good time.
That's right. And so you have to, what you would do in like real life situations tactically isn't considered in the tactical vacuum of an MMA arena, right? Like what's going on in the tactical situation? Like, it's okay. What's the best tactic to use in the fight? I don't know. And the reason I don't know is because I don't know what's going on tactically.
Yeah. Every fight specific.
Yeah, right. Like, so it's got to be 100 videos on YouTube. Maybe they've all been taken off now because of censorship, but there used to be like guys on the schoolyard getting on top of somebody mounted like they're going to end the fight, and then somebody else comes by and just boom takes their head off with a kick or something. It's like maybe the mount isn't the superior position,
right,
in a schoolyard fight because his buddy's going to take your head off, right? Like, so that's the same kind of difference between a real fight, because it's not a tactical vacuum. Like there's other shit going on. Mm-hmm. Like I ask my students, do real fights have time limits? They all say no at the beginning because it sounds like the right answer, right? No, real fights, they don't have time. They do. Yeah. All real fights have a time limit because there's a tactical situation that imposes a time limit on the fight. Yeah. Either his buddies are coming or your buddies are coming. And that's going to change the nature of what you do. Mm-hmm. Right? If my buddies are on the way, all I got to do is stall. Right. Not let you kill me. Pretty soon, John shows up, and now we're beating the crap out of this guy. Yeah. If his buddies are coming, I could break his neck with the Kung Fu death grip, right? His buddies show up before I get away. I still lose, right? So you have to think in terms of what's the, Yeah. Now go back to like stages of training. First, you learn the hierarchy position. It's in a tactical vacuum. You're playing the game of jiu-jitsu. Then you add strikes. Then you add weapons. Then you add tactical circumstances. Yeah. Like imagine when you see the videos of Craig and his guys, live grappling in the freaking front seat of a car. It's a little different than a jiu-jitsu match, right? Like, and somebody's got a weapon and there's a steer wheel and a gear shift in the way. Right. Suddenly there are other things that you kind of need to know, like that you probably didn't think of when you were in that cage,
Right. Yeah. He incorporated elements of like rock climbing into there, which is like,
wedge yourself into here so you have a base, right? Like, how do you do that? Put your foot against this or post your hand on the, what I mean? Or whatever it happens to be. Right. And if you are so I used to have a gig years ago. The guys that I was training, their job was they picked guys up on the street. So it was a 2-man element, right? It was a driver and a interviewer, and they would pick guys up in the street to make clandestine meetings, right? And so the fights that would happen like in the back seat of a car, because you don't know if this guy's a good guy or not when you pick him up, right? And you don't know if it's going to go south. So if it goes south, you're fighting in the back seat of a car. Okay, you're fighting in the back seat of a car armed, like.
Not a good time.
Moving and you're in a neighborhood you might not want to be in. Like, So the whole thing was about how do you get gain dominant position on somebody in order to make sure you control who is going to be able to employ the weapons while fighting in this. Okay, so that's those are things that you must actually be training for, or you're gonna be clueless about it, right? So
right. And then you start unpacking it. It's like you can discover the answers when you got like kind of the right shoulder. But Matt, like what we come in here, like we ran over an hour. So I think we're exceeding. I think we got to do like another
long-winded part to this. I know. So
no. It's like when people are ready to. I would tell people to kind of listen to these things that we talk about, these conversations. I mean, I listen to stuff we did, like, I don't know, when we first, got together, and I'm like, oh, okay. And it's like, when you have the perspective, the lessons, the impact of the lessons are a lot. So I think, just making sure that we kind of have this documented is really important. So, but with that in mind, got the Combative Summit coming up. What are your thoughts on that? Having something like that and just being part of it.
I covered last year about how, what's actually happening. The big picture, just so everybody, knows my thoughts. The big picture is that America's martial art is emerging. And because, with all that we went through in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and all the other people, law enforcement, et cetera, as MMA, jiu-jitsu, whatnot came around, and, from all the way back from the 70s to today, action shooting and all the advances in that, what's really happened is we have this emergence of the skill set that you would like the person next to you to have in a fight, and it's become common across like all these various warrior type organizations. You know what I mean? Like if I'm on patrol and the cop shows up with me, I'd like the guy to be able to shoot, have first aid skills, be a strong fucker, and be able to help me in a grapple, right? That's not too much different than if I was a SEAL on some freaking reconnaissance mission and I got in trouble. The skill set is the same, right? Or is very, very similar. And we mostly learn them using the assets that are available to us in our local area. So almost everybody's training at the local jiu-jitsu or MMA gym. Almost everybody's shooting at the local, USPSA or IDPA club. Most everybody is, lifting weights, etc. But with that being said, what's happening is that stuff is merging together, and there are a lot of people who have become the experts at how those things integrate and understanding the weaknesses of those assets that are available to us all.
Right.
You know what I mean? You go to the flat range and you're shooting USPSA matches, you're gaining skills that they're very useful, you need to have on the battlefield.
Yeah.
But they end here because in that environment, nobody practices this stuff. Yeah. And the same thing is true of grappling or MMA or et cetera. Just like I was saying, MMA, it happens in a tactical vacuum. So you'd be the baddest fighter in the MMA gym, and you're definitely a good guy to have on your side in a fight. But you haven't had to consider all the other tactical considerations that happen in real fights. So those venues fall short in that regard. And so, the value of the summit is there's an emergent crew of people who are the people pushing the envelope in those gaps, filling the gaps to what is available to all of us. And they're not available everywhere yet because most people in the martial arts are hobbyists, right? Most people shoot because they enjoy shooting. Most people grapple because they enjoy grappling. And then the tactical aspects of it are not their thing, right? It's like I always say, all over America right now, people are learning to fight with katanas, right? It's not because ninjas are going to accost them on their way to their car when they leave the mall, right? And so that means that those things are not pressed to be real. Right. It's not, you know what I'm saying? Nobody's coming to the jiu-jitsu gym and saying this must be real. Right. Okay, so it's not. It's got unrealities built into the culture. Shooting culture, the same, etc. And those people who fill the gaps, they're rare right now. And the best ones in the world are the ones that we've got coming together at the summit. And that's my opinion as somebody. Look, I've been a martial artist now since 1984 when I joined the Marine Corps, right? Like Reagan's first term, okay? Like a fucking long time ago. And that, watching that, the martial arts culture in America change over that time and the lessons learned as we learned all these, imagine the renaissance that happened whenever the UFC came along and everybody learned about jiu-jitsu, and suddenly there was a bullshit filter for, 5-animal kung fu and etc. So that same thing is happening now with live fighting and real fighting. And these are the guys who are the most expert in the world at that, filling those gaps. So everybody should be training at the local jiu-jitsu gym, shooting at the local USPSA or IDPA or whatever's available club. They should be lifting weights. They should be getting all the first aid training that they can get available to them, et cetera, et cetera. They should be doing that all in those environments. And then they need to be tapping into these guys who are the experts that fill in the gap. I've mentioned some of them on purpose when we've been talking here, because these are some of the guys that I think, are some of the best guys in the world, that whenever they teach a class, I'm like, oh, that's excellent. Yeah, I really, could learn something in that, you know what I mean? And I've been in this tactical space, specifically since the mid 90s. And whenever somebody comes along, I mentioned knife control concept guys earlier, Craig, and all his stuff he's got going on. And several of the guys I mentioned, like, okay, well, that's because those guys are really got something interesting happening, and look, if I'm learning something from it, you will too.
Right.
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned, and there's some people who are real experts, and so I hope to see everybody there, and I hope to learn a lot. There's 2 or 3 other guys who are going to teach this year that we haven't seen in the past, who I'm really looking forward to seeing their blocks of instruction. You know what I mean?
Sick.
And and look forward to just watching the American martial art, continue to emerge.
Badass. Yeah. So, guys, we're gonna definitely, Matt's like one of my fucking best friends in the whole world. So we're gonna be talking a lot more. I'm gonna twist his arm to get here, get his thoughts on, document it, so we can not only just have it for the guys coming up, but just for the guys in the future. Because I mean, who else has done 30 years of cultural development inside an organization? Who's had the fucking patience for that shit? It's like, Jesus Christ. So with that in mind, so hey guys, so with that in mind, make sure you guys follow, make sure you guys share this with your friends, and we'll keep bringing you more from America's
Hey, one more
Podcast.
thing before everybody goes. Listen, if you got things that you would like to hear us talk about, hit John up with the questions. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we'll be happy to discuss anything that you guys are interested in.
Yeah, I think other than the cadets, I think I'm one of the last few people that's actually like spent a lot of years like learning directly from you, which is pretty damn cool. I didn't even really think about that.
I have, so the guys who work for me now, they're like, they help me teach the cadets. They're all like, majors in the Army with master's degree in fitness who are like attack helicopter pilots and freaking infantrymen and tankers and shit. Right. And smart guys. And we, it's tough. Like I said, I don't think people appreciate, like John and I have been, we've been training with each other and friends for more than a decade. And we used to train with each other. Like we lived in the same town, trained at the same gym, and John helped me with contracts and whatnot as we were training, some of the clandestine units and whatnot. And so there was a lot of together time, so that's why we have this relationship. So.
Yeah. So Matt, love you, brother. And we'll keep bringing you more. Thanks, Matt.
You too, John. Thanks, everybody. See y'all soon.